You're listening to the Stand Up with V Dominic podcast. This is episode 5. Please subscribe and like it and give it a good rating. Tell your friends. Take your friends' phones and your family's friends' phones. Subscribe and like with their phones as well. This podcast is, of course, free, but my Patreon is up, which means you can support us with a paid subscription. Get all kinds of bonuses until we get so big that we can start selling advertising. And it is Veterans Day, so I thought I'd have a conversation with a veteran. A few years ago, I did a weekly segment for almost a year in partnership with the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America Association. I want to bring that back. I want to bring all of my guests back and have new conversations with them for the podcast. So we're going to do that this week, talking to a lot of veterans, and I want to kick it off with a very interesting, very accomplished woman who I met years ago when she was working at the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. She's done so much. Here now is my conversation with Allison Jaslow on episode 5 of the Stand Up with Pete Dominic podcast. Okay, joining me today is Allison Jaslow. She is a veteran of the U.S. Army, and she served in Iraq twice. She was awarded the Bronze Star and many other medals. Allison was the executive director of the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America organization. And it's a nonprofit, by the way, that advocates for the interests of veterans of those two wars. It's actually where she was when I first met her. She ran a successful campaign for Congress, helping Sherry Bustos get elected to the House. She then became her chief of staff. She was also the press secretary to decorated Vietnam War veteran and Senator presidential candidate Jim Webb. Allison has testified before Congress twice. Her work has appeared in many different outlets, from the New York Times, Washington Post, and many more. You may have seen her commentary on most of the major networks, and she's even consulted on several noteworthy feature films. Really excited to be recording a conversation that we'll post on Veterans Day with this amazingly accomplished human being. Ladies and gentlemen, my conversation with Allison Jaslow. Hey, Allison, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, it's a pleasure.
Let's start with this question, which there is no right answer to, but I do want to ask you, as a veteran, what is your personal feeling on people finding out that you're a veteran and saying the phrase, "Thank you for your service, Allison"?
You know, I've evolved a little bit. I think, like, especially when you first get out and you've, like, come straight out of war into civilian life, as I did, it was hard to kind of, like, negotiate it because it felt very reflexive, like people almost, because of their discomfort, would just say thank you for your service because they felt like that's what they had to say. I understand, like, the intent and effort behind it, like, I think, a decade later, and so I try and accept it with a little more grace. But honestly, at every opportunity that I have to turn around somebody thanking me for my service into a kind of call to action, and to really challenge them to ask themselves what they're doing to serve, is like the best conversation that I like to land in after somebody thanks me for my service. But
Really?
otherwise,
Do you have an example of? Do you have an example of where you've done that, like where someone says that and then you kind of turn it back to them, like, thank you. What have you done?
Well, I try not to be too aggressive, I would say. But, I think, like, if you have the space, like, sometimes people do it really kind of hit and run. I think if you have the space to actually engage somebody in conversation as to whether they actually know any veterans themselves, whether their families have served, what they do to serve, you can sort of open up that conversation. It's a hard one to have, but
Sure.
Perhaps, this is me using that opportunity to sort of raise that point where somebody's not going to get defensive, Pete.
Yeah, exactly. It's not easy. That's a delicate dance. But the issue, I understand why you're saying that, and you've written and talked a lot about this, and you certainly made me aware of it, IVA and so many others, is that most people don't serve. And so the fact that most people don't serve in the military, what are the statistics? Like 99% of Americans don't serve or even really know somebody in their family who does. And what that means is, of course, and why that matters is, when we do have conflicts, when we do have wars and any other issues, we're not really thinking about people who serve because we've got no skin in the game. It doesn't really harm us. There's no draft. There's no war tax. How am I doing? Is that the issue?
Yeah, I mean, that would be part of the issue. I mean, I think that, like, there's literally no emotional connection, and, war service, or even the threat of war. Obviously, we've had soldiers overseas since after 9/11 at this point. But even if this was a peacetime, scenario, like having people who had more of an emotional connection to something that is by nature very political, like our decisions to go to war, is important, which is, I guess, to my earlier point, why I think it's important. If everybody was walking around sort of thinking in the larger context of how they want to be serving our country, whether it's in uniform as I did or not, it would potentially create a little more solidarity than there is today, where we're essentially outsourcing our wars to less than 1% of the population, subsidizing it with contracting services that we're putting into our national debt instead of actually, having the shared sacrifice of figuring out another way to balance books. But I think that there are too many people who are far disconnected, not only not having somebody in their family, but feeling any type of sacrifice for the wars that we're in.
I know like Stanley McChrystal and a lot of people who aren't necessarily in the military, and I think I support this idea. I haven't really thought it through. Do you support the idea of some kind of national service, which of course doesn't necessarily mean just the military? It can be AmeriCorps, the Peace Corps, or something that we haven't invented yet? Why?
In large part because I don't think that we really have, I think our national fabric is really torn more than it has ever been before, right? Which could be a lot longer.
And not in our lifetime,
political commentary.
Yeah.
But I think, again, you don't have to serve the way that I did, but I don't know that there's an ethos of service. The way that people sort of remember, at least our grandfathers and grandmothers told us, existed during the Greatest Generation.
So you went to University of Missouri, and you were in the ROTC, is that what they say? Am I doing it right?
Yeah, you are.
And then and then you joined the Army. I mean, you don't explain that program, and you don't have to join the Army after ROTC, but why did you, and when was that?
Well, I actually wanted to be in the Army for a career. I decided when I was in 8th grade that was what I wanted to do, and so I feel very grateful to have the opportunity to go to school on an ROTC scholarship. But more than anything else, I wanted to serve. I got a great.
At 8th grade, why? What young girl in the U.S. Makes that decision in 8th grade?
Well, I consider myself the only success story of Career Day that I know. I didn't get anything that I chose on a list of field trips that we could do for Career Day, but found myself on Fort Myer, which is like connected to Arlington National Cemetery. And listen, they put on a real good, show for us. But, in summary, I was swept off of my feet that day. I think, for those of us who sort of feel a calling to service for our life, and that's been sort of a theme for my, ever since I decided to go to school on an ROTC scholarship and a pathway to the Army and what I've done since. I think it's just the first way that kind of ignited that fire in me. And listen, I had a pretty bumpy childhood, and it ended up being a really great sort of North Star for me. One thing to really be able to focus on.
Sense of purpose or discipline or organized. I mean, I don't know what you mean by bumpy childhood, but was there any family members in your in the military?
Both my grandfathers, but not my immediate family. No.
So you joined the U.S. Army when? What was your job? And tell me, if I want to fast forward about your first deployment.
Sure. So I actually was, I got my ROTC scholarship pre 9/11. I started college in the fall of 2000. So all the Afghanistan War and the Iraq War actually developed while I was in college. But I was sworn in, as a second lieutenant in May of 2004. And, to your second question, I found myself deploying to Iraq the day after Thanksgiving that following November.
What was your job? What was your rank? What were your responsibilities?
I was a second lieutenant. I deployed with what you'd call a battalion headquarters, but ended up, because I was a fresh second lieutenant, what you're supposed to be doing is, quote, platoon leader time. So I was attached to a reserve unit that fell up underneath our battalion that was based in Saginaw, Michigan, back here on the state side. Ended up being a platoon leader over a sort of supply mission, a bunch of different warehouse operations in a place called Taji, Iraq. That mission was actually fully contracted with the exception of what is called a captured enemy materials warehouse that I had.
When you say fully contracted, you mean the people that were on that mission were not military members? They were government contractors?
Yeah, so Kellogg Brown and Root, which is a subsidiary of Halliburton, actually came in and was awarded a contract for all of my soldiers' jobs, which meant that my soldiers' jobs then became both force protection and what you call convoy security or gun truck. So for the duration of the deployment, which would be I don't know, there's probably 9 to 10 months of the deployment left at that point, their job was to secure logistics convoys in and around the Iraq area of operations.
So at that point, 2004, what was the culture, atmosphere, and responsibilities like for a woman in the United States Army? Because it seems like a lot has changed that role, and obviously culturally, so much has changed in such a seemingly short period of time for women. And maybe, obviously, if you disagree, this is something you're obviously an expert on and have had experience with. But when you were there, what were your responsibilities? What did it mean to be a woman? What could you do? What could you not do? How were you seen?
Well, 2004 was well before women were allowed in, sort of what are combat roles by doctrine.
Right.
That was also a time of a lot of change on the battlefield. I mean, we were rapidly adapting our armor. It felt like it's 6-month iterations to keep up with not just an asymmetrical battlefield, but the insurgency that were doing everything from small IEDs in Coke cans on the side of the road to daisy chain 155 howitzer rounds buried beneath the ground, to also elevating, IEDs off of light posts. So keeping up with their rapidly changing tactics, and basically the military, which I'm not breaking news here, was very ill prepared for sort of that type of environment, deploying with soft-shelled Humvees. And so the Army itself, or the military itself, was undergoing a lot of change, in addition to the fact that we slung women across the battlefield. I was in a logistics role. I can only speak for, my experience, because there were, a lot of different women confronting different things, especially MPs, I think, found themselves in more force protection scenarios than one would, typically expect. But listen, I feel very grateful that personally I was able to earn the respect of a lot of my colleagues. So I didn't experience a lot of, challenges, I don't think, myself. I think most of the rigors of the deployment and the strain and stressors that I experienced during both of my deployments were due to other factors. But I can't say the same for a lot of other people I've encountered both in my military career and since.
Right. You have your own experience, and while I really want to hear about that, of course, as well. But you're saying everybody has their own experience. You don't want to generalize, certainly about women, much less anybody in the military. That being said, those supply chain missions, were you hit ever? And is that an awkward question to have to answer or inappropriate for me to ask?
I don't think it's inappropriate to ask. I've definitely had somebody ask me, I kid you not, at a wedding reception if I'd ever killed anybody before. That can be an awkward one to take. But
how did you answer that, especially at a wedding? I mean, it'd be one thing if I asked you in this interview and we could talk about the appropriateness of that or what it means or how you deal with that. But at a wedding, what did you say? Do you mind sharing?
I basically told the woman who asked me that just wasn't an appropriate thing for us to be chatting about at a wedding reception for our friends.
Fair enough.
I think that it was a well-intended question from a very curious person, but
Right.
But I mean, I think that listen, I feel very grateful that I have the emotional constitution that I have, and I can kind of navigate those questions. I think you have to be really careful who you ask those questions of, for fear of what you may trigger in them.
That's what my concern is when asking
to.
you. Yeah, that's what my concern was when asking you. I don't want to trigger you, but I also want to make real the experience that people have and to help understand how people deal with it differently. Of course, some people navigate it better. Other people end up killing themselves. So there's a wide range of how you deal with these things, which is the only reason why I ask.
Yes. So to answer your question, my vehicle never got direct contact. convoys I was on were hit. Convoys I was on also like took fire, if that makes sense. But we were definitely, I mean, a lot of the routes that I was able to go on went either between, Taji and Balad, Iraq, which is just north, or south through like Sadr City and into, a place called Rustamaya and Mahmudiya below. It definitely is one of those things where like you had to adapt to the ever-present danger. Like there were a couple of daytime convoys that we went on where, like no shit, I mean, Baghdad is like any other like metropolis. So think about doing a military convoy during rush hour in any city. So when you're trying to basically speed as fast as you can up the streets that have full of traffic, it's quite the effort to try and, move cars out of the way. There are times where we had to open up doors and like push other cars off of us. Again, I feel really grateful for my experience because, I actually lost a buddy during my first deployment where, he essentially did the same thing that I would have done, on a crowded, or maybe not so crowded, but when he encountered traffic on a highway. And, at the time we were supposed to use an escalation of force. So you'd shout at them, you'd throw a rock, you'd maybe throw like one of your water bottles. Every so often you'd bump the car to just get them out of the way and get them off the road, especially if you saw a woman driving, and he did that and the car blew itself up one time. So,
oh my God.
Yeah. And it's, I think those experiences are really sobering. But again,
that's the idea of knowing that you're out, whatever your job is. In this case, you're in Iraq, you're guarding convoys, that at any moment, something terrible could happen. There can be an explosion. You'd be shot at. You'd be killed. And whatever that does to your nervous system, your emotional spectrum, whether it prepares you, over prepares you. There's so much that goes on there that I've heard from so many veterans. That being in that situation, and then you come home and you see garbage on the side of the road and that type of thing. Like, what does that do to a person? Is always the question that I wonder about each person who's been in that situation. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that like the hypervigilance that you sort of training yourself is really hard to decompress from. Yeah, I don't know the right phrase, but I just to give you like an illustration, so one time when I was living in DC, a good friend of mine and I decided that we wanted to go down to a place called Haynes Point during the Cherry Blossom Festival, which is a horrible idea. It was a gorgeous day, but we forgot about like the type of traffic, especially foot traffic during that time of year. Right. We're sitting down there by the tidal basin, and literally there's swarms of people coming across sort of like the traffic that's at a standstill in that area. And I had to say to her in a very calm voice, I was like, I don't want you to think that like I'm having a freak out here right now, but I just have to vocalize that I'm a little concerned that one of these people are going to blow themselves up right now.
Right.
Because that's just the way that you train
yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
and I
understandable.
think I'm better at compartmentalizing than a lot of people. I think if compartmentalizing isn't something that's great for you, which I think that there are a lot of reasons why compartmentalizing isn't great for the average human, it can be hard to kind of like negotiate those feelings, I think, when you come back stateside. And we're all different. So we all respond to either the traumas or experiences or even what we had to deal with or not deal with, right? Like people have regret. My friend Casey really struggled with the fact that, he got hit, somebody died, somebody lost their legs in his Humvee. He was totally fine and was tormented with it, for the rest of, his life, which unfortunately ended shortly.
I'm so sorry to hear that. So what about the important question about the simple idea that when we train you to go to war, and then when you come home, there's not enough of a processing out, certainly when it comes to psychological, what you saw, how you dealt with trauma, if you dealt with it. And that's, of course, every generation of veterans, of warriors have dealt with that. I guess we have gotten better, but we still seemingly have a long way to go in terms of the out processing. How much of an issue is there right now what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong, Allison, to help bring veterans home and help them get back into a civilian life or just deal with whatever they dealt with?
I think we've come a long, long way since, like 2003, 2004, 2005, maybe even all the way up till 2008, because it wasn't until 2008 that, even the post 9/11 GI Bill was passed. But you had this influx of veterans who were flowing into the system, especially people who were called off the inactive ready reserve. They were guardsmen and reservists, a whole bunch of people who, enlistments were up at the height of the war and just decided to get out. And we were just woefully unprepared. Like the VA didn't have capacity. Our Defense Department was so distracted by just sort of chasing its personnel issues that I don't think that they were worried about, helping make sure that there was a smooth, safe transition for the people who were leaving and going back to civilian life. So all that's to say is that like a lot of improvement has happened both in government services and sort of the ecosystem of other veteran service organizations and empowerment organizations across the country. I think one of the biggest challenges that still exists, though, in my opinion, is, to our point about the military-civilian divide before, there's not a lot you can do about the fact that many veterans are still going to feel very isolated in our society today. You compare it to, World War II, where there were neighborhoods of people who were vets who served. You go to a Legion post and it was, packed all the time because so many people were serving. I think that when you transition out today, if you go back home, it's very likely that you are among a whole lot of people who don't understand your sort of life experience. And without that familiarity, there is no, or isn't the appropriate empathy.
There's a loneliness and there's a lack of solidarity and there's a lack of understanding of what this person is going through, and there's a lack of resources for that person to find any answers in. I'm paraphrasing what it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, and that doesn't like necessarily, lend itself to, a higher veteran suicide rate either, right? Like the feelings of isolation. I think that that's probably a contributing factor, but it also means that employers don't know how to deal with that. Like, it doesn't matter how many programs we put in place. It's like, if you don't know somebody, you're going to put your foot in your mouth, or you're going to, or potentially, I think a lot of people let their discomfort dealing with vets or their worry about saying the right thing get in the way of having the meaningful connection that's truly going to help them transition back into civilian life. And then also being open to the fact that it could be a bumpy road, and not being too hard on them.
Yeah. But it sounds like that's interesting, because then I would ask for your advice, because it sounds like we as in the public, civilians, don't necessarily know how to deal with, let's say, even if we have the best intentions. So what would your advice be for the rest of us who haven't served if we encounter a veteran at work or in our family, in our home, in terms of trying to, I don't know, accommodate them, let them know that you support them, you understand them? What could we know as the public to do better to handle it?
I mean, I don't think it's rocket science. It's, the old saying, like, meet people where they're at. Like,
I love that. Yeah.
Instead of like clamming up, just say like, hey, gosh, you served. That's awesome. What made you want to sign up? Talk to me about your experience. Like I think there are casual questions that you can ask that can get people to open up about their time, that don't come at them with assumptions about why they serve or what they must have experienced, why they served there, et cetera, in a way that can maybe, begin to build a better bond where you can get to some of the deeper questions, or maybe they can proactively share some of those things.
Let's go to back to Iraq real quick, if you don't mind.
Love going back to Iraq. If any flashback.
Are you being sarcastic?
Yes. I feel like if you're a comic, you could handle a little bit of sarcasm.
Oh, believe me, bring it. And if I don't take it right, just make sure you keep delivering it, because I think it's important.
Totally.
For sure. But my question is, how much do you think about Iraq? And more specifically, I've talked to a lot of men and women who've served there, Afghanistan or elsewhere. When I always am really interested, just as a curious person, how much interaction did you have with the Iraqi people? Did you have relationships with Iraqi civilians? Did you work with people who are contractors? And if so, how much do you think about where they're at now, so many years later, given what's gone on in that country?
So I interacted with Iraqi soldiers and then, contractors, which, to be honest, some of the contractors that were pulled into the system, I don't know if they were all Iraqi nationals or also from, other sort of countries in the area.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't get the opportunity to develop a deep bond. You hear about many other service members who had an interpreter with them for many months, in the trenches serving next to them. I didn't have one of those experiences. Most of mine were, with helping them with any other types of logistics issues that we would have, or coming across them at checkpoints or force protection points. But there wasn't a lot of small talk happening in those instances. I guess the best anecdotes I have from those stories is you want to talk about people who really couldn't get their head around women serving. It was the Iraqi soldiers who couldn't quite grasp it. It was you could see that we were very novel to them.
What do you mean? What happened? How did they behave? What did they say?
Well, I think it was also it's, you're not just a woman, but I have a very pale skin tone too, and so I think that they're just Iraqi men who hadn't come in contact with somebody like me, wearing a military uniform ever before culturally. So I didn't speak the same language as them. You're just reading body language. But I think those are the things that stick in my mind more than anything else.
Is there any way for you to give a kind of a succinct answer, or does it always deserve a thoughtful answer about how you see the Iraq war, not necessarily your role in it, but how you see the war itself, just for you personally, now where we're at in 2019, almost to 2020, and it seems like there's a lot happening right now in Iraq and in the region. How do you see America's role, the invasion, the occupation, and what good come of it, if it was helpful, if it made the country more fractured, as a lot of people think? Is there any way for you to answer that, or does that require hours of talk?
I don't know if that's you assuming that it's a really complex issue or whether I've been too wordy, but
No, it's only no. You've not been too wordy. I do think about time as an interview, and I'm I still want to talk to her about all these issues dealing with women and all these other things, and so I almost just it's I just want to get a succinct answer to get to other things, but I feel also it's unfair to give us a succinct answer, but maybe it is. Maybe you can look at it and say, I don't want to put words in your mouth or thoughts. So,
well, I guess the most succinct answer I can give you is that it frustrates me that our political and media culture these days demands succinct answers for really complex issues.
Great answer.
I agree to your point that it is very complex. People's lives are at risk. Foreign policy decisions, impact more than just lives. If you look at sort of the skyrocketing debt that we put ourselves in for these wars, there's a lot more there to discuss, to unpack. And I actually think it's a disservice to not just service members, but the American people and the future of our country to have a soundbite discussion about something as important as this.
Can you give me a soundbite or succinct answer on what you think the purpose of life is? I'm trying to think of another question that cannot be answered succinctly, because what you said just now is so important to me and so right on about media. You asking that question is only to keep this conversation interesting for you to move on for the sake of time, and me answering that question short, in a brief way doesn't do any of it justice. And therein lies the problem with our media culture, much less the way that maybe we listen to conversation.
Yeah, and I think we put ourselves in a position to too quickly move past the important discussions. And sometimes I think it's because they're uncomfortable discussions.
Oh, yeah.
But maybe we need to have some uncomfortable discussions about some really important things, in our country today.
Well, how about this? I mean, I love talking to you, and we can do, another conversation specifically about any number of these issues, many of which we've hit on today, because I would love to have a longer, thoughtful question about that conflict, America's role in it, where you see Iraq today, and you're you're part of the Council on Foreign Relations. You have a lot of thoughts about this stuff, not only from your own service, but from just getting educated on all of it. So maybe we can come back to it at some point, but. Before we do have to wrap up today's conversation, you've written a lot about, talked a lot about, and of course at IAVA advocated for so many different issues, but specifically I did want to ask you about women, female veterans. At the Washington Post, you wrote a piece called VA Has a Woman Problem. It starts with its motto, and you advocated to get that changed, and I think you did. Marie Claire magazine, you had an article titled, Female Veterans Are Routinely Dismissed and Diminished. Vice, you wrote a piece titled Women Veterans Deserve More Respect for Their Service. And I wanted to ask you about all of those, but let's just, I don't think we have time. So just that last one, I think would be probably the best one to take on, because that's kind of ongoing. What is the issue with women veterans and the, I guess, lack of respect that they get for their service?
I mean, I just don't think that we have a culture that, adequately recognizes women veterans. I mean, listen, culture change is hard. You have the luxury within the military, I actually think, to escalate that just because of the type of environment that it is. People have to fall in line. You have a mission and imperatives that force people to sort of escalate and bring to parity where women should be with men. I think that changes when you go out into a society and culture. And again, to come right back around to the military-civilian divide, it's if you don't know soldiers, if you don't know women soldiers and men soldiers, then you have a hard time wrapping your head around what veterans look like too, which extends to women veterans. And if you're not seeing them in the media, if you're not seeing them in culture, like in movies, then your vision is not, when you close your eyes, somebody who looks like me. It's some macho guy you've seen in a Navy SEAL movie, or, maybe an old guy with a hat over at a local Legion post. It's not a woman veteran, but women are serving too. And I think the fact that we haven't embraced them from a cultural perspective is a disservice to women who are putting their head down and aren't asking for a lot of recognition, except for just to be seen.
Is there anything specifically that we could do better, or be curious about, or support in terms of initiatives, or much less thoughts or actions?
Well, I mean, specific action. I'm not at Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America anymore, but I was very proud. You mentioned the motto. That was sort of a keystone of the Women Veterans campaign that we launched a couple of years ago that actually hasn't been changed yet. It is the VA's motto, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and his widow and his orphan, doesn't recognize women veterans.
Him, his.
Yes.
That's the motto, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan. What's wrong with that?
I mean, if a motto is a guidepost.
Right.
And so I think, if you're going to have change, it has to start at the top. And if all of America is supposed to take its cues from the VA, I think, maybe that's where the problem is. Or at least that's why we tried to focus on it.
It's not political correctness, by the way. I feel like we talk about language. Oh, you're changing language. Everything's got to be political correct. No, it's not that. It's language affects the way that we think, and our thinking affects the way that we behave. How did I do?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, listen, Allison, awesome talking to you. You're an amazing human being, so accomplished, and I hate to end it, but I don't want to take any more of your time, so I hope that we can pick this conversation up and just keep going. Thank you for all the advocacy and all of the public service you've done, not only in the military, but of course in Congress and the civilian sector. I cannot wait to see whatever you're doing that is next. Thanks for talking to me today.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Allison Jaslow. A lot more veterans to join me here on Veterans Day week. It's Stand Up with a Veteran, an old segment we did. We're bringing it back. And here at the end, I always like to answer questions or ask questions. So I asked on Facebook, what is the worst mistake or oversight you've ever made as a homeowner? Or, alternatively, you can answer this, what is the best investment in your home that saved you money? something that flooded or burnt down the house, of course, would be the extremes. Got some really fascinating answers on my Facebook page if you want to check it out. Here's just a select few. David said, we didn't turn off the water before vacation, and my mom's toilet fitting leaked for 2 weeks from the top floor of her townhouse. Ooh, David, thank you for that. Be sure to turn the water off before you leave for a long period of time, folks. Aaron writes, worst mistake was buying a home and property while America is on the verge of another depression. Then he included a lot of emojis with the one tear. Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, we're underwater on our mortgage because we bought it on 2011, and then the housing bubble burst all over my face and neck. Andrew says, good speakers in the house. Oh, so many people listen to their phones and tiny Bluetooth speakers, and they are really missing out. So invest on good speakers and enrich your life. Great idea, Andrew. I will take that advice. Our friend, the legend, Bruce Bartlett, said, new doors and windows save me a lot of money. Thank you, Bruce. That's a good idea. New doors and windows. And lindos. Why do I keep wanting to say lindos? Kevin writes, not paying enough attention to my surroundings before pulling the trigger and becoming the homeowner. Now I have a dandelion farmer to one side and a crack house on the other. Kevin, sounds like a fantastic neighborhood. I'd love to come over. Monis writes, friend bought an auto water shutoff. Saved him a flood in the basement. Another friend bought good smoke alarms and saved his family from a fire. Barry says, best simple change, changing out all of our incandescent light bulbs for LED bulbs. Big cost initially because the LED bulbs are pricey, but we had a dramatic reduction in our election bill. And last but not least, Diane says, best, solar panels. Worst, buying a house with cheap cabinets. Thank you for all your advice to homeowners. I think we all just learned some lessons. Great ideas. Answer the question on my Facebook page. That's Pete Dominick. Or you can tweet me at Pete Dominick or email me, Stand Up with Pete Dominick. Don't forget to like, subscribe, rate, and check out the Patreon. And you can subscribe by paying at patreon.com/Pete Dominick. Talk to you on Wednesday right here on the Stand Up with Pete Dominick podcast.